The lecture had been running for 11 minutes when Professor Vithka clicked to the fourth planet on his list and described, without changing his tone at all, how the atmosphere there would dissolve most carbon-based organisms at the cellular level within 6 seconds of direct exposure. I was on my third cup of something the station cafeteria called coffee. It was not coffee. It was brown and warm and came out of a machine that beeped twice before dispensing, which were the only two qualities it shared with anything I had grown up drinking. The mug was mine. Ohio State logo, handle chipped on the left side from a fall off a dorm window ledge during a bad thunderstorm 2 years ago. My mother had handed it to me the morning I left for the Academy shuttle port. She had wrapped it in a dish towel and placed it in a canvas bag with 3 other things: a spare phone charger, a small jar of peanut butter, and a handwritten note on a square of yellow paper that said "Take care of yourself" in her large, slightly tilted handwriting. She wrote fast, like the thought was moving ahead of her, and she was chasing it down the page. I thought about that note more than I had planned to. The lecture hall held 43 students. 42 of them were not human. I had stopped nodding this every single morning around month 4, but Monday mornings the count still ran automatically before I could stop it, the same reflex that makes your eyes find the exits when you walk into a new room, the one that feels like a leftover from something older than manners. The course was Xenobiology 4, Class Omega Planetary Systems and Survival Designations. Second year, required for all Academy students regardless of specialization. I was specializing in interspecies ecosystems, which meant this course was technically within my field, and I could not reasonably object to being enrolled in it. I sat in the back row anyway. The back row had been my default since the 6th grade in a school in a small town in Ohio, and the habit had outlasted every change of address and institution, and had apparently survived the relocation to a space station 12 light years from where it started. Professor Vithka was tall, pale, and built like someone had designed a person primarily for conference rooms and low-stakes administrative work. 4 eyes, 2 of which read from his notes, while the other 2 monitored the room with the patient, slow rotation of a system that had long since stopped expecting surprises. His voice came through the translation implant in my left ear as careful, even, and carrying the particular register of a man who had accepted, a long time ago, that the universe was mostly hostile and found this professionally interesting rather than personally troubling. He moved through the catalog. Veth 7, sulfur atmosphere incompatible with carbon-based respiration. He clicked. The burning corridor, binary star gravitational shear causing soft tissue disruption at the molecular level. He clicked. The methane belt of Druvak, the frozen shelf of Karath, the acid lanes of the outer rim, each entry delivered at the same pace in the same structure. Atmospheric data, gravity index, biological hazard rating, known sapient casualties from documented exploration attempts. Then a pause, during which the room absorbed the information the way dry ground absorbs rain, slowly at first, then all at once. The class reacted to each planet the way a crowd reacts to a very close call, a collective tightening, pens moving faster. The bioluminescent patches on Fainlu's neck, 3 rows ahead and 2 seats left, had deepened from their usual pale amber into something denser and more unsettled, a color I had been cataloging over 8 months and still did not have a reliable name for. Arath 7, who occupied the far left section of the hall alone, because his species communicated partially through low-frequency vibration that disrupted other students' concentration in a radius around him, had been vibrating at his usual baseline of soft ambient engagement through the first 4 catalog entries. At entry 5, he went completely still. When Arath 7 went still, things were serious. I drew a dog in the margin of my notebook. 4 legs, circle for a head, a tail curling into a question mark at the end. The same dog I had drawn in the margins of notes since I was 12 years old, never improved, never a good dog, never intended to be. It was the thing my hand did when the rest of me needed to process without appearing to process, which was a skill I had developed at 12 and refined across 2 degrees and 8 months in a classroom where, every Monday morning, the count came out to the same number and the same remainder. SS Oketh sat to my left with 6 limbs spread across a desk the Academy's accessibility coordinator had extended for his reach. 4 limbs writing simultaneously in parallel columns, 2 keeping him anchored and still. He had occupied this seat every session since the semester began. In that entire time, we had exchanged approximately 20 words, all of them practical and logistical. Neither of us had pushed past the practical. It worked. Some arrangements hold, because they do not ask for more than they need. Veeth Ka reached the slide labeled Class Omega designation criteria and settled into a longer explanation. The designation, he said, was not applied lightly. A Class Omega world was not simply cold or dry or low in oxygen in the way that many worlds were cold or dry or thin-aired and could be managed with the right equipment. A Class Omega world was hostile in multiple directions at the same time. Atmospheric, biological, geological, and radiological threats stacking rather than substituting for each other. Addressing one threat category did not reduce another. The cumulative hazard index exceeded the adaptive and technological capacity of any known sapient species, not in theory, but in documented outcome across decades of exploration data. He said, these environments naturally selected for aggressive cellular adaptation, shortened lifespans, and hyperactive adrenaline responses in whatever organisms managed to persist within them. I stopped writing. My hand rested above the notebook with the pen between my fingers and the sentence I had been taking notes on ending mid-word. Natural selection for aggressive adapt, and then nothing. I tapped the pen against the side of the mug. Once, twice. I noticed I was doing it and stopped. Veeth Ka said the following entry would serve as the primary case study for the remaining sessions of the unit. He said it was the most extensively documented Class Omega environment in the Academy's galactic records. By a margin that was not close, he said, it was the most extreme example of continuous sapient presence on a condemned planetary body in any database the Academy maintained. He clicked. 42 alien students produced a sound that did not have a word in any language I knew. Not a scream and not quite a gasp, something existing between those two things that apparently crossed species lines when enough different organisms converged on the same specific flavor of dread at the same moment. The dread of having suspected something was real, and then seeing it confirmed on a projection screen with coordinates and a hazard rating attached. On the screen, Sol III, Class Omega 7 Deathworld, designation condemned. Below the designation, a photograph taken from orbit, blue and green and white, cloud cover in slow spirals above an ocean that consumed most of the frame. The land visible in the upper portion of the image was that brownish-green of the northern hemisphere in October, when the angle of the light changes and the trees begin to release things, and the afternoons stretch long, and the air carries a quality that people who have lived inside it know without needing to describe it, and people who have not cannot quite reach no matter how many words you use. I had lived inside it every October for 23 years. I looked at the photograph. I looked at the chip in the handle of the mug. I looked at the photograph again. I turned the page in my notebook. The dog with the question mark tail disappeared under the new page. I did not draw another dog. Then Veeth Ka clicked to the next slide, and I understood that the easy part of this semester was behind me. The first slide of the Earth unit carried atmospheric composition data. Oxygen content, 21%. The Academy's scale rated this as mildly corrosive to most respiratory systems adapted for lower concentrations. Extended exposure would cause oxidative cellular stress in the majority of sapient species. Veeth Ka noted this with the tone of a man identifying a minor but recurring structural flaw in an old building. "We call it air," I said. Not loudly, not as a disruption. The words came out at conversational volume the way corrections do when you hear something described wrong and the brain routes the response to the mouth before the manners can catch it. Ssoketh's 4 writing limbs paused for 1 full second and then resumed. He did not look at me. The pause was acknowledgement, and I had learned to read it. Veeth Ka looked at me briefly with the 2 eyes not currently engaged with his notes. He looked back at his notes. He moved to gravity. Sol III's index, 1 standard, at the upper threshold of long-term tolerable for most sapient species. Skeletal compression and cardiovascular strain in visitors from lower gravity environments. He listed 4 species for whom unaided surface exposure would require medical intervention within hours. I thought about my cousin Dan coming back from a 2-year geological survey station running at 0.4 gravity, walking with the careful negotiating steps of a man whose knees were filing a complaint with management, and the way we had laughed about it on my mother's porch in August with the windows open, and the fan going and the ice in the glasses already half melted. I did not write any of that down. He moved to temperature range. Earth's surface temperatures across latitudes and seasons exceeded the comfort parameters of most sapient species by a factor of 3 to 4. The axial tilt producing seasonal variation was categorized as a contributing environmental load factor. The fact that the dominant sapient species had voluntarily established permanent settlements in regions experiencing winter on a regular basis was listed, without editorial comment, as a data point warranting further study. I grew up in Ohio. I looked at my notebook. He moved to meteorology. Electrical storms generating millions of volts of atmospheric discharge across vast geographic areas. Wind events producing sustained speeds fatal to unprepared organisms. Seasonal pressure systems generating flood conditions spanning entire regions. Precipitation capable, in its frozen form, of burying structures and halting transportation networks across entire continents. He noted that these events occurred on predictable seasonal cycles, and that the dominant sapient species had constructed permanent settlements in their direct and documented paths. The student in the 5th row had wrapped both arms around themselves in a self-enclosing posture I recognized from humans, an instinctive tightening that apparently crossed species lines under sustained environmental stress. Dren, in the 2nd row, whose species expressed distress through color shifts across their back plating, had gone from standard dark gray to a lighter, variable tone that moved as I watched. Fain Lu was cycling color continuously now rather than settling, patches shifting through shades in a pattern I had not cataloged before, which looked to me like a system having trouble arriving at a single response. I held the mug with both hands and watched the room absorb the meteorology data. Veeth Ka moved to geology. Earth's tectonic plate system, he explained, regularly released stored energy in events that destroyed surface structures and reshaped coastlines. Not historically, currently and actively. It was not a problem awaiting a solution. It was a permanent architectural feature of the planet, built into its fundamental mechanics, ongoing at this moment, and at every moment before and after this moment in the planet's operational history. He showed a geographic distribution map of major seismic events across 2 centuries. The map was nearly solid with data points. He moved to volcanic activity as an extension of the same system. Eruptions capable of projecting ash across hemispheres and lowering global temperatures for years. He described one event as occurring in Earth's recent geological history. I wrote the word recent in my notebook and placed a question mark after it. Then I crossed the question mark out because I knew the timescale he was using and he was not wrong. I did not like it. He was not wrong. Then Veeth Ka moved to indigenous biology. He said Sol III's biological hazard profile, was among the most extensively documented in the entire Class Omega catalog, and that he would address it in order of organism scale, beginning with microbial life. Earth's pathogenic ecosystem, he described, was among the most aggressive and adaptive in the known galactic record. Bacterial and viral populations mutated at rates that routinely outpaced pharmaceutical intervention. The dominant sapient species maintained permanent, ongoing pharmaceutical development programs not to reduce the baseline pathogenic threat level, but simply to prevent it from growing faster than it already was. He said this without pausing and moved directly to the next scale. Marine invertebrates with venoms capable of causing cardiac arrest in organisms many times their body mass. Terrestrial arachnids operating the same mechanism at smaller scale. He noted with academic neutrality that some of these arachnids were nearly invisible and lived in the same spaces the dominant sapient species used for sleeping. Arath-7 made an audible sound, not a vibration, an actual audible vocalization. The room registered it. I registered it and moved on. He continued up the scale. Large terrestrial mammals with mass and aggression ratings equivalent to documented alien apex predators. Aquatic megafauna. Ambush reptiles in tropical regions. Several large herbivores statistically more dangerous to humans than the acknowledged predators, due to unpredictable defensive behavior and significant physical mass. He listed the hippopotamus. I almost said something, I held it in. He listed the mosquito. He noted, in the same tone in which he had noted every other fact this session, that this small flying insect was responsible for more deaths of the planet's dominant sapient species in recorded history than any armed conflict the planet had produced in the same period. The room went quiet in a different way, not the quiet of cumulative distress, the quiet of a single fact reorganizing something. Fainlu's patches went white. I had not seen white before in 8 months of sitting near enough to watch them. I filed it in a category I did not have a name for yet and kept it there. Then Vithka said, and finally the dominant sapient species itself. He clicked. The new slide listed the entry under the heading Fauna. I looked at the word. Fauna. I set the mug down. Not hard, not with any dramatic force. I set it down the way you set something down when your hands need to be free for a thing they cannot actually help with but need to be free for anyway, because the body sometimes acts on what the mind has not yet put into words. The entry read, Homo sapiens sapiens, sapient species, class, fauna, hazard designation extreme, assessment to follow. He began the assessment. Human physiological data presented several anomalies in the xenobiological record, he said. Pain tolerance readings at the upper extreme of the Academy's documented index for carbon-based sapience. Skeletal and muscular density exceeding environmental necessity for the species' size, producing impact resistance readings that the initial modeling team had flagged for review. A cardiovascular system showing sustained extreme exertion data at intervals, the Academy's Endurance Modeling Division had initially categorized as data entry errors and sent back for secondary verification. The verification had come back positive. He described persistence predation, an early hunting strategy documented in Earth's archaeological record, he said, in which humans pursued prey animals over distances exceeding the prey's physical endurance threshold, not through superior speed but through sustained, continuous, unceasing effort until the prey could no longer continue. The prey stopped. The human did not. The Academy, he noted, had initially classified this behavior as biologically implausible and requested independent verification. The independent verification confirmed it. He moved forward. The dominant species appeared to have developed what the Academy classified as anomalous continued functioning under conditions of acute physical and psychological distress. Complex cognitive and social performance, maintained during levels of pain, exhaustion, and sustained fear that triggered shutdown responses in most other documented sapient species. This was not limited to exceptional individuals or crisis events. The behavioral data indicated it as documented standard baseline functioning across the general population. He said, the precise adaptive mechanism remains an active area of academy research. He clicked to the next section. I was still looking at the word fauna. I had a cousin named Lily. She was 22. I had been to her funeral 7 months before I left for the academy. In a church in a town I had driven through my whole life without thinking much about, and I had sat in the third pew in a suit I had borrowed from my roommate Owen, because I did not own one, and I had held it together through the whole service and then cried in the car for 20 minutes on the highway, which was the only privacy I had. That tracks, I thought. My pen rolled off the edge of the desk. I did not pick it up. He listed us under fauna. The pen was still on the floor. The professor had moved to behavioral adaptations, and I was aware of the pen the way you are aware of something you have decided, without formally deciding it, to leave in place for the time being. Vithka described what the Academy's behavioral models categorized as hazard normalization. Sapient species in sustained hostile environments, he explained, developed reduced threat response sensitivity to consistent environmental hazards over time. The brain reclassified continuous background threats from the acute response system into ambient background conditions. This was the working academic explanation for why the dominant species of Sol III had remained on a class Omega world across generations, without systematic evacuation efforts or population collapse. I raised my hand. Vithka stopped. All 4 eyes oriented to me. He rarely used all 4 on a single point of focus. It was the positioning he used when something had occurred that required full processing power to assess. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something has been building without being named and is about to arrive. Hazard normalization, I said, means we stop noticing. He waited. We notice, I said, we just go to work anyway. He held my gaze for a moment slightly longer than routine. He made a notation I could not read from the back row. He turned back to the slide. Several students had shifted in their seats to look at me. Not all of them. Enough that I was aware of it the way you become aware of background sound, not announced, just present. Fainlu had turned fully to face me, their patches holding a deep still blue I did not have a catalog entry for yet. SS Oketh was looking at his notes in a way that meant he was not looking at his notes. The professor moved to the physical and psychological endurance comparative table. Human endurance indices set against those of 15 other sapient species. On most standard measures, humans placed around average or below. Rest requirements, nutritional recovery, tolerable environmental range. Middle of the table, nothing unusual. Then the final 3 rows. Sustained functional performance under continuous physical distress. Humans, highest documented index across all 15 species. Continued operation during acute psychological distress. Humans, highest documented index. Time to complete behavioral shutdown from combined environmental and psychological load. Humans, no documented upper limit found. He read these entries in the same voice he had used for everything else. I looked at the table. I thought about my mother working 2 jobs for 6 years and still writing notes on yellow paper because I had mentioned once, in passing, 3 years before it mattered, that yellow was easier on my eyes first thing in the morning. She had filed that, held it, used it at the right time. I looked at the mug. It was a mug. It had a chip. It had survived a fall, 2 moves, and 8 months on a space station, and it was still a mug, and I used it every morning. The professor moved to social organization and settlement patterns. Human communities, he described, formed dense, fixed settlements in close and documented proximity to multiple overlapping environmental hazards. The Academy's behavioral models offered two interpretations: resource access optimization or hazard normalization already discussed, with available evidence insufficient to cleanly distinguish between them. They are not the same thing, I said. Vithka stopped again. Soketh put down two of his four writing limbs and left them resting on the desk surface. He said nothing. He kept his front eyes on his notes and his secondary eyes at a slight angle toward me, which was his way of listening to something other than the professor. You can know something is dangerous, I said, and choose to stay because the place is yours. That is not normalization. Normalization means the perception of danger has reduced. This is something different. The perception of danger is intact. The calculation is different. Vithka said, "Can you clarify the behavioral distinction for modeling purposes?" People go back after floods, I said. You noted that in the meteorology section. You said the historical record shows communities returning to flood-prone locations even when alternative sites were available. That is not those communities forgetting the flood. They remember the flood. They go back because the place is theirs, and leaving it is a different kind of loss than the flood was. The Academy's model assumes the rational outcome is evacuation. The model might be measuring for the wrong thing. The room was very still. Vithka made a notation. He said, "This interpretive framework will be addressed in the unit's academic literature review in Session 6. He moved forward. Fain Lu had raised both hands in a position I had not catalogued before, not raised the way students raise hands to speak, but held open and forward in a gesture I was going to have to ask someone about later, something that looked, in the context of everything else their body was doing, like formally marking that they had been present for something that mattered. I picked up the mug with both hands. Vithka moved to documented human relationships with indigenous megafauna. He described the practice of maintaining non-sapient animals in domestic cohabitation arrangements, including in some cases species with active predatory behavior or significant physical hazard potential. He presented this without editorial comment, which was somehow more striking than if he had commented. He listed documented cohabitation species. Felis catus produced low-range alarm from 2 students. Canis lupus familiaris produced from Dren, a sound I categorized as genuine astonishment. Then he reached the entry for the common wasp. Vespula vulgaris, venomous stinging insect, moderate pain index, territorial behavior when nest is disturbed, nests established in frequent proximity to human dwellings. He read the documented human behavioral response. In a statistically significant proportion of cases, human inhabitants made no attempt to remove proximate wasp nests. Common cited rationale: the nest presented no active threat if left undisturbed. Alternative cited rationale in a subset of cases: the insects were present before the human occupants arrived. He said, the Academy classifies this as a notable case study in behavioral cohabitation with active hazard organisms. My mother had said they were there first. I had been 9 years old. She had been standing on the porch with iced tea, looking up at the nest under the eave with the expression of a woman who had a long list and had just made a final decision about which items were not going on it. They were there first, she had said, and that was the entire discussion. I set the mug down. I ran my thumb across the chip in the handle. Then the professor clicked, and the small orbital image in the corner panel changed. The photograph from orbit was replaced by a ground-level photograph. Wide frame, low horizon, the sky filling the upper 2/3 of the image in a shade of afternoon blue I had not seen in 8 months because the station's light systems produced approximations and not the actual thing. Below that sky, from one edge of the frame to the other, a cornfield. August, full height. The specific green of the Midwest in August when the growing season has gone right, dense and moving slightly in a wind the camera had caught mid-pass. One unified shift of the whole field, like it had just taken a breath. The slide label read, Sol III, Representative Terrain, Midwest Region, Class Omega 7 Deathworld. The field near my mother's house was 3 miles down the county road, belonging to a family named Brewer I had never spoken to. Just a field I had walked past for 15 years and run through as a kid, and watched from the porch in October when the stalks were dry, and the light came down at the angle it came down. I had not thought about it specifically. I had not known I had memorized it until I was looking at it on a screen in a classroom 12 light years away, labeled as evidence of a condemned world. I thought about my mother. I thought about the note on yellow paper. I thought about Dan walking funny after the low-gravity station, and the way we had laughed and how that was less than 2 years ago, and already felt like something I was preserving carefully to prevent it from fatting. I thought about Lily's funeral and the borrowed suit, and the 20 minutes on the highway. I thought about sitting in this classroom every Monday for 8 months, and doing the count every morning and not saying anything about the count, and not saying anything when the weather was a crime scene, and not saying anything when my species appeared under fauna. And I thought about the weight of all that not saying accumulating in my chest over 8 months, and how it had a mass now, a real physical mass, and how looking at the cornfield on the screen was the thing that gave that mass a direction. My pen was on the floor. I looked at it. I stood up. I did not decide to stand. My legs made the decision and the rest of me followed and found itself upright before the paperwork had been filed. The chair scraped back against the lecture hall floor with a sound that traveled across the room like something dropped into still water, a clean, flat impact, and then the rings moving out. 42 students turned. Professor Vithka stopped mid-sentence. All 4 eyes found me and held. The room held the quality of stillness that exists in the interval between lightning and the sound that follows it. The brief space where something has already happened, but the full weight of it has not yet arrived. I said enough. Just that word, one syllable. It sat in the room by itself and occupied the space the way a dropped object occupies space before anyone moves to pick it up. The professor did not speak. The class did not speak. Fainlu's patches had gone completely motionless in a single fixed color I was going to have to catalog later. Arath 7, still and silent since entry 5 of the original catalog, seemed to go even more still, if that was possible, as if whatever stillness he had been holding had found a new level below the one I knew. SS Oketh had set down all 4 of his writing limbs flat against the desk. In 1 semester, I had never seen him do that. "That is my home," I said. Not loudly. I was not going to shout. I did not feel like shouting. I felt the opposite of shouting, which was the particular feeling of wanting your voice to stay level, because the alternative was something you were not going to do in a classroom at 9 in the morning. "You have been up here for almost 2 hours describing my home, like you are reading a damage report." The professor said nothing. "I know the data," I said. "I have read the catalog. It is accurate. The sulfur in Veth 7's atmosphere would kill me in 6 seconds. The burning corridor would take me apart at the molecular level. I understand the comparison. I understand why the designation exists." I paused. "But those are my cornfields." I pointed at the image on the screen. The August field, green and dense and mid-breath. "That is my weather. Those are my wasps. That is the light that comes in the afternoon in October in the northern hemisphere, and I have stood in it every year for 23 years, and it is mine." Nobody moved. "We know it tries to kill us." I let that sit for a moment. "I want to be clear about that. We know. We have always known. This is not confusion. We are not normalized to the degree that we cannot perceive the threat. We understand the oxygen content. We understand the tectonic activity. We understand the pathogens and the ambush reptiles and the venomous arachnids in the sleeping spaces. I thought about the mosquitoes. We understand the mosquitoes and we go outside anyway, because the outside is ours, and we are not going to stay indoors because of mosquitoes. I heard a small sound from the third row. I could not identify the species or the precise emotional content. I kept going. You described persistence predation, I said. You said the Academy initially classified it as biologically implausible. Secondary verification confirmed it. I want to tell you what it feels like from inside it, because the data does not cover that part. Veeth Ka was very still. His stylus was in both hands and he was not moving it. It does not feel like being unable to stop, I said. It feels like choosing not to. It feels like something you were handed down by everyone who came before you who also chose not to stop, and the choosing stacks across generations, and after a long enough time it is just how you are built. But it was choices all the way down. It was always choices. I looked at the cornfield on the screen. At 4 in the afternoon in August, that field cast long shadows between the rows, parallel lines across the dirt like something written in a language you felt before you could read it. I had sat on a fence rail at the edge of a field like that one summer when I was 16 and stayed there for an hour doing nothing at all, just being in the place, and it was one of the cleanest hours I could name. I did not say any of that. I said, my mother grew up 40 miles from where I grew up. Her mother grew up in the same county. Her mother before her grew up in the direct path of a tectonic fault line and a flood plain and 2 species of venomous snake, and she grew a garden and raised 4 children and lived to be 81 years old. I looked at the professor. The Academy designates Saul III as condemned, I said. The criteria are accurate and I am not arguing them. You are measuring by thresholds that are not ours. That is fine. The measurement is technically correct. I am not arguing the measurement. I paused. But condemned by whose threshold? I said. Not ours. The room held the longest silence since the session began. I said, we live there anyway. Not as a declaration, not as a challenge, as the plain statement of a fact that had been sitting in my chest for 2 hours in a room full of people describing it as a horror, and had not once considered that, for one of the people in the room it was also, simply, home. The silence after those 3 words was different from every silence that had come before it in that session. I looked at Fain Lu, the still color on their patches. I looked at SSO Keth, 4 limbs flat on the desk, not writing, just resting there, present. I looked at Arath 7. I looked at the room. I looked at the professor. Veeth Ka was holding his stylus in both hands. He was looking at me with all 4 eyes doing the same thing at the same time, and the expression on his features was something I had not seen on him in a semester of watching him teach, something that the translation technology did not cover because it was not language, and which I filed carefully without trying to name it yet. I looked at the cornfield on the screen one final time. Green, dense, holding its single-caught breath in August light. I had a note on yellow paper in a bag in my quarters on the station. I had a mug with a chipped handle on my desk. I had stood in October light in a field in Ohio and felt the size of the place around me and felt, in the same moment, very small inside it, which was not frightening, which was actually the closest thing to peace I knew. I stood there one moment longer than was comfortable. Then I sat down. I reached down and picked up the pen from the floor. I placed it on the desk. I did not write anything. Veeth Ka looked at me for a long time. Then he closed the slide. The cornfield disappeared. He stood at the front of the room without moving to the next slide, without consulting his notes, without speaking, for an interval I did not count but which felt significant in the way that measured silences feel significant. Then he moved the session to general biological survey conclusions and covered them in 12 careful minutes, And the class ended, and nobody asked questions and nobody raised their hands, and the students filed out in a quiet that was different from the ordinary end-of-session quiet in a way I felt clearly and could not quantify precisely. I do not know why the cornfield disappearing made it worse. It did. The lecture hall emptied in stages. The front rows left first, moving toward the exits in ones and twos, the quiet of people who have been present for something and are processing the having been there on the way out. The door sealed behind each group with the same soft mechanical sound. I counted 4 exits, then a longer pause, then 2 more. Then the ambient sounds of the upper rows, the small movements of collected belongings and vacated chairs. Then those 2 were gone. I stayed in my seat. The mug was on the desk with both my hands around it, the liquid inside gone cold sometime during the session. The station cafeteria's version of coffee was bad when warm and categorically different when cold, which was information I had accumulated over 8 months, and which had never once stopped me from drinking it cold when I was sitting somewhere and not ready to move yet. I was not ready to move. The pen was on the desk where I had placed it. I looked at it. I did not pick it up. I was aware, without turning, that someone was still in the room. Soketh had not left. I became aware of this the way you become aware of a sound you have been hearing without registering, all at once, without being able to identify the moment it became audible. He was still in his seat to my left, all 6 limbs in the resting position, which for his species meant limbs distributed evenly along the desk and chair frame, not writing, not positioned for motion, simply existing in a space without any immediate functional task. He held that for approximately 30 seconds. Then he collected his notes. He did it with a deliberate and careful alignment of each document sheet against the others that I had never seen him do before. His standard end-of-session process was efficient and quick, the movement of someone with the next task already queued and ready. This was slower. Like the care itself was the point rather than a consequence of the process, like he was making something of the ending of it. He stood. He moved toward the door. At the threshold he stopped. He turned. He said, "Marin Cole." I looked up. He was standing in the doorway with the corridor light behind him making his outline clean and clear. He did not step back into the room. He stood at the threshold with 2 of his eyes on me and 2 at a slight angle away, which was the positioning I had associated, over a semester of sitting next to him, with something he was still working out internally while already beginning to say it. He said, "On my homeworld the gravity is 0.3 standard." He paused. "A human," he said, "would not structurally manage well there." I said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that means something is being organized rather than nothing being said. He said, "I have never left my homeworld before this station." I looked at him. He looked back at me with the 2 direct eyes and the 2 working it out eyes. He said, "Thank you for the session." He left. The door sealed. I sat with that for a while. The room had a different quality now that it was only me in it. Not bad, just present in the way spaces become present when you are the only one occupying them and they stop being shared and become personal. I was aware of the ceiling, the institutional cold of the environmental systems, the low baseline hum of the station's mechanics that I had stopped hearing most of the time and occasionally heard again when a room went quiet enough. I should call my mother. I had been meaning to call for 3 weeks, not because I did not want to, but because the call required a series of transitions I had been navigating poorly lately. The transition from station time to home time. The transition between the version of myself that functioned here and the version that knew how to talk to her. The transition into the conversation itself, which would be warm and would be brief, and would end with her asking how I was eating and me saying fine, and both of us meaning more than we said. I was not going to call her today either. I drank the last of the cold coffee. It tasted like burned ambition, and a decision made correctly that you could not stop second-guessing. I set the empty mug down and looked at it. Ohio State. The logo slightly faded from 8 months of whatever the station's cleaning system used, which was not quite the chemical composition the logo had been designed to withstand. The chip in the handle, the weight of it in my hands, which I knew completely without thinking about it, the way you know the weight of things you have held in many different circumstances over a long enough time. She had wrapped it in a dish towel. She had put peanut butter in the bag. She had written the note on yellow paper because I had mentioned once, casually, 3 years before I left, that yellow was easier on my eyes first thing in the morning. She had kept that piece of information for 3 years and then used it at the right moment, which was the kind of thing that costs something, and she had never once made it seem like it cost anything at all. I looked at the mug. I looked at the empty room. The door unsealed. I did not turn immediately. I knew the footstep pattern behind me. Single pair, light and deliberate, moving toward the front of the room. A pace I had catalogued over a semester of arriving just after he did and leaving just before. Professor Vith had come back for his datapad. He retrieved it from the lectern, with the 2 eyes reading the surface and the other 2 oriented slightly away. The positioning I had come to associate over a semester with something he was managing that he had not finished processing. He stood at the front of the room with the pad in both hands. He did not leave. I did not say anything. He said, "The designation will remain." "I know," I said. "The data is accurate." "I know." A pause, the low mechanical hum of the station filling the space between us. The cold. He said, "The endurance data." He stopped, began again. "Your species' endurance data. We ran comparative modeling 3 years ago as part of a Class Omega survival factor study, the running specifically, the persistence predation documentation." I waited. "The figures," he said, "in the model." He looked at the pad in a way that meant he was not reading it. "We had to run the model 4 times before we submitted the paper. The outcomes were consistent across all 4 runs. We published anyway with a methodology note attached expressing the modeling team's uncertainty about the input parameters." He said, "I wanted you to know the figures were not errors." I looked at him. "I know," I said. He held the pad. He said more quietly, with something in his voice that the translation technology processed, and then produced a version of that I did not fully trust as accurate but took anyway. "The cohabitation data, the WASP entry. In my original notes from when I built this unit, I have it flagged as a possible sampling artifact. The frequency of the documented behavioral response, the rationale given." "It is not an artifact," I said. He looked at me. "The documented rationale," he said. "They were there first." He paused. "That is in the field data verbatim. They were there first, as the cited reason for not removing an active hazard organism from a domestic dwelling." "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a moment that had more weight than its length warranted. "That is not a category in the xenobiological behavioral models I work from," he said. "No," I said, "I do not imagine it is." He looked at me for 3 full seconds with all 4 eyes doing the same thing, which was the second time today he had used all 4 on me, and which I was going to think about later when I had the room to do it properly. Then he nodded, a small, deliberate nod, a gesture he had picked up from human students across some number of years of teaching them, and which he used rarely and which meant, when he used it, something he did not currently have the right language for, and was choosing that gesture instead. He walked toward the door. At the threshold he stopped, without turning back, occupying the same position in the doorway that SSO Keth had stood in 20 minutes before. He said, "Session 6 will incorporate an alternative interpretive framework for the behavioral settlement data, the one you identified today." Then he walked out. The door sealed behind him. I sat in the empty lecture hall. The front screen was blank. The cornfield had been gone since he closed the slide, which had been the right thing to do, and the blank screen was a flat white surface reflecting institutional light without quality or character. I opened my notebook. I turned to the page with the half-drawn dog in the margin, the circle head and the question mark tail, and the notes that ended mid-word. Natural selection for aggressive adapt, and nothing after it. I looked at the blank space below those notes. I picked up the pen. I drew the cornfield from memory. It was not good. I had never been good at drawing fields. The corn came out as a row of vertical lines of varying height, which was accurate in structure if not in anything else. The sky above the corn was 4 horizontal strokes, the lowest one slightly curved in an attempt to suggest the way the sky sits close to a flat horizon in the Midwest, which on the page looked more like a ceiling than a sky, but which was the best I could do. In the bottom left corner of the image I drew my mother's porch, a rectangle for the walls, a smaller rectangle for the door. 2 approximate shapes that were meant to be chairs, which came out as rough squares on the porch surface. A flat horizontal line extending from the top of the rectangle for the eave. Under the eave I drew a small oval. The wasp nest. It was a bad drawing. The corn looked like a comb. The porch looked like a child's first architectural attempt. The sky looked like a ceiling. The wasp nest under the eave looked like an egg. It was the truest thing I had drawn in 8 months. I looked at it. I thought about the Brewer family's field and the October light, and the afternoon in August I had sat on the fence rail and stayed for an hour doing nothing, and how when you have been away from a place long enough the small hours inside it become the thing you keep returning to, not the landmarks, not the notable moments, just the hours that were not notable at all and which turned out to be the whole thing. I thought about Dan coming home from the low-gravity station and laughing on the porch. I thought about Lily at 22. I thought about my mother writing fast because the thought was moving ahead of her. I thought about Soketh at the door saying he had never left his homeworld before, saying it the way people say the thing they have been holding and chose at the last moment to put down. I thought about Fainlu's patches going white. I thought about Vithka saying the figures were not errors, which was a sentence that had a shape to it I was still working out. I thought about 42 species making the same sound at the same moment when they saw my home on a projection screen, the sound of something being confirmed that you hoped was exaggerated. I thought about how that sound was also, at its core, a recognition, the recognition that something was real. It was real. It had always been real. 8 billion people on a condemned world, who knew it was condemned and grew gardens and raised children and built porches under wasp nests and wrote notes on yellow paper and kept chipped mugs and chose not to stop. Every day, all of them, choosing not to stop. I wrote under the drawing, in the flat careful print I had used since grade school, slow enough to be legible and fast enough not to lose the momentum of it. Sol III. Class Omega 7 Deathworld. Designation condemned. Population 8 billion. They were there first. I read it back. I added one more line, smaller than the others, fitted below the rest. Average survival rate, see above. I looked at what I had written for a moment. Then I closed the notebook. I picked up the mug. I stood up from the back row in the back of a lecture hall on a space station, 12 light years from a small town in Ohio, where a wasp nest had lived under my mother's porch eave for 15 years, untouched, because they were there first, and that settled it. I had xenobiology lab in 40 minutes, then an advanced seminar, then a reading assignment I had been avoiding for a week on deep ocean thermal vent ecosystems on Druvak's third moon, which was genuinely interesting once you cleared the first 40 pages of methodology summary, and I had been putting it off for no good reason, and today was the day I was going to stop putting it off. I had a full day. I picked up my bag. I walked out of the lecture hall. I went to class.